What is going on, everybody? I hope you're having a great day today. This is Alex from the Fresh Fantasy Podcast, and this is the first episode of season 4. Yes, we are back with the Fresh Fantasy Podcast for another season. I could not do it without the support of all you listeners, so I appreciate you tuning in once again. But today we're going to be breaking down the top early fantasy storylines of the 2023 season. We'll be talking about players from each position, whether or not we are buying or selling their current narrative. And joining me today to break this all down is one of the best data-driven fantasy football analysts on the planet, who was once nicknamed the Rocket Man for his meteoric rise in the fantasy football industry. He is the director of fantasy and gambling at one of the biggest up-and-coming sports companies on the planet, and he is also a really great friend of mine, a friend of the show, and a friend to everyone else in the community. He is the 33rd Team's Josh Larkey. Josh, welcome back to the show. How are you feeling about season 4? I think your first appearance on this podcast was in season 2.
It was, yeah. Before pre-show, we were reminiscing a little bit, and I was like, "Was I in season 1, season 2?" Turns out I was on early in season 2, and that's kind of what started our friendship, our connection. And I think it's been cool to see how each of us have kind of grown on our different paths. You call me the Rocket Man, but I mean, if we're being honest, when I was in college, I was doing anything. I literally hadn't played fantasy football yet when I was your age, so I was on the baseball analytics track. I was hardcore with it. So excited to see kind of what you do, and thanks for having me. And I think everyone needs to know that you're contractually obligated to have me as the first guest through the 33rd team. So
No, not at all. As much as I would like to think so, but like you said, you were on a baseball given track when you were, around the college age. So who knows? Maybe I'll end up selling mattresses by the time I'm 30 years old. We just don't know at this point, but only time will tell. But right now we are talking fantasy football, and we are going to start with the quarterback position, work our way down through running back, wide receiver, and tight end today. The first storyline I want to talk about, I have to say, there's always a player every year that catches my eye and I start to fall in love with, and maybe I deserve it, maybe I don't. Last year it was Trey Lance, and obviously it did not work out. The year before, it was DeAndre Swift, and it mostly worked out before he got hurt. The year before that, it was Calvin Ridley. No one cares about the past. We're here for the present, and that is Justin Fields. The first narrative I want about is that Justin Fields will finish as a top 5 QB this season with his new weapons. Josh, we will start with you. Are you buying or selling Justin Fields as a top 5 QB, and why?
We're going to buy this first narrative. So we're starting off strong. Fields, if we think about last year, he dealt with some injuries. He had a couple himself. There was the Khalil Herbert injury, the Darnell Mooney injury, and that left him many times last season where Dante Pettis, Byron Pringle, Equinemius St. Brown, and N'Keal Harry were dominating the snaps at wide receiver. Weeks 7 through 15, he found his stride. He averaged 28.9 fantasy points per game over those 7 games, which was the most in fantasy football. And again, that was without any weapons. Mooney didn't even play for all of those games due to his high ankle sprain. Fields can legitimately be the overall QB1 this year. The way I see it is that Hurts, Allen, Mahomes, kind of a nice top 3. They're safe with high ceilings. And then I have Fields as my QB4 right now, just ahead of Lamar Jackson. I think that Fields and Lamar are going to run a similar amount, but at the end of the day, one of those guys is going to be playing with DJ Moore, Chase Claypool, and Darnell Mooney in 3 wide sets. And that sounds quite appealing right now, considering what he was dealing with last year. And that at the end of last year, essentially, he had none of those guys due to injuries.
Yeah, no, I'm all on Justin Fields. I'm also buying him as a top 5 QB. Last year, he was the QB7 despite missing 2 games. And over his last 10 games as a fantasy football quarterback, he finished as a top 10 QB 9 times. The biggest thing, like you talked about, Josh, the fact that he had one player with over 500 receiving yards, and that was Cole Kmet with just 544. I mean, I think we think about the guys that were narratively awful passers in Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts going into their 3rd year in the league. And I think that Justin Fields also kind of fits that narrative. Granted, Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts got Stephon Diggs and A.J. Brown. I don't think that DJ Moore is necessarily on that level, but bottom line, he got a huge quarterback upgrade. He's had absolutely no one producing, and I think that he just needed a true wide receiver 1 before he could explode. But you could also argue that Justin Fields already exploded. His 3rd leading receiver had 323 receiving yards. This was the team that passed for the lowest amount of pass attempts over the last 15 years. Even the Falcons with Kyle Pitts were higher than the Bears last season. So if passing volume increases, Justin Fields keeps running the ball. All wheels are pointing up for Justin Fields this year. But the next quarterback I want to talk about, maybe not the greatest human being, but he is a great fantasy football quarterback, and that is Deshaun Watson. Narrative is Deshaun Watson will finish as a top 10 QB. Josh, are we buying or selling Deshaun Watson as a top 10 fantasy football QB this year?
I'm going to buy this one too. We're going to go 2 for 2 to start off. So if we look at Deshaun Watson, we'll just get it out of the way. We don't like him as a person. But if we are looking specifically at fantasy football, he averaged 24, 21, 21, and 23 fantasy points per game his first 4 seasons. And then he had only 14 last year per game. I am willing to forgive his fantasy point woes last year because the guy took 2 years off of football. You have now a full offseason for Cleveland to tailor the offense to him. And I'm really confident that he returns to top 10 form. And I think that he is the most likely quarterback that can break into that type of elite group that can once again average close to 25 fantasy points a game, which is sort of like that Hurts, Allen, Mahomes, Fields, Lamar type zone. So I'm very confident in Deshaun Watson. I think he's getting drafted too late right now in fantasy football. He's going a few rounds after Herbert and Lawrence, and I kind of feel like that's the range that he should be in right now. So I am absolutely buying him as a top 10 fantasy QB.
Yeah, no, I 100% should be buying him as a top 10 fantasy QB. And again, I think that like some of us, might not be drafting him because of ethics. They don't want to ever cheer for Deshaun Watson throwing a touchdown for the person that he is, and that's fine. But from a fantasy football market perspective, that's somewhere where you can take an advantage is, when someone gets discounted in price for one reason or another, there's a fantasy football advantage you can take in. But the biggest thing about Deshaun Watson is he's played 3 seasons with at least 8 games, and he's finished as exactly the QB5 in each season. Even last year, from small sample size, from when he came back till the end of the season, he was the QB14 after coming back and not playing for 2 years. He's in the Brown system for another year now. He has Amari Cooper and David Njoku and Nick Chubb, someone really great at each position. They also have Donovan Peoples-Jones, and it's not like Deshaun Watson never had really great weapons in Houston. I mean, his most notable weapons were obviously DeAndre Hopkins. After that, it was really just Will Fuller, who missed at least 5 games in every season that he played with Deshaun Watson. So, unfortunately, I'm all in on Deshaun Watson as a top 10 QB. I will be taking advantage of what his price is going to be, and I cannot get enough of him. The next one is someone I'm really excited to talk about, going to the running back position. We have 3 running back narratives to talk about. The first one is Breece Hall. And that is Breece Hall will immediately return to form as a top 10 running back from week 1 and beyond. Josh, are you buying or selling Breece Hall as a top 10 running back coming off of his ACL tear?
So if we interpret immediately return to form as in week 1, this guy is back, then no, I'm not going to buy that. The 33rd team zone, Dr. Jess Flynn, I text with her, shoot her over a lot of injury questions. I think she's pretty much the best in the business at what she does. And she does not think that Breece Hall is going to be Breece Hall come week 1. That is pretty unlikely. But should he be 100% after a few weeks when he's actually recovered and he hits maybe 12, 13 months after the ACL tear? Absolutely. I'd say from midseason onward, he's a top 3 running back. I know that he had the injury week 6. Saquon 2 years ago had it in week 2. And that was week 2, 2020, Saquon tore his ACL. If we look at 2021, a lot of people were disappointed with Saquon, but it's because he had a freak injury where he rolled his ankle. Weeks 3 and 4 of 2021. So early on, when he's coming back off the ACL, he had over 20 fantasy points in back-to-back games. He looked like his old explosive self. And then in week 5, he steps on somebody else's foot and rolls his ankle. And then, of course, that's just what happens with running backs with high ankle sprains. They usually don't look like themselves the rest of the year. But basically, Saquon was back around 12 to 13 months post ACL. I think Breece Hall is going to be the same. You just cannot fade the guy at this point. So he was someone I was a little concerned about with injuries. And then after talking with Dr. Flynn, I am now pretty confident that midseason onward, this is a top 3, if not the RB1 in fantasy, with Aaron Rodgers in town, who, as we know, is that perfect combination of elite quarterback that can move an offense and not mobile enough to run and tuck the ball. So he's going to be dumping it off to Breece Hall as well. So PPR RB1 upside overall.
Yeah, I'm all in on actually. I'm going to buy this. You might be selling him being ready come week 1. I'm going to buy it. Like you said, he tore his ACL October 23rd of 2022. That 9-month average, recovery time to at least be playing, even if they're not playing at 100%, would put him at about July for this year. And I'm not a doctor. I'm probably not the right person to report it. But ultimately, the players that recover from ACLs quicker, from numerous guests we've had on this show to talk about ACLs, is that the more athletic the running back, the better that they are going to be coming off the ACL. And I think Saquon was a perfect example where, before he had that freak ankle injury, he was a top 6 running back. He struggled right out of the gate in the first game or two, but then after that, he was immediately Saquon Barkley. Yes, he might have been 4 weeks earlier than Breece Hall, but ultimately Breece Hall was a top 10 running back already as a rookie. And now he's going to most likely have Aaron Rodgers in the offense, which will make this Jets offense look a lot better. And when Breece Hall tore his ACL till the end of the season, there was no other running back that took significant touches away. There was not a consistent running back one for this team. So it's not like you're playing with a Samaje Perine or an Alexander Madison or someone that's going to be elite handcuff and take a lot of touches. They don't have that. This offense is going to be better. They're going to score more points, but ultimately Breece Hall is still one of the best prospects we've seen. We talked about this a lot last year. He's one of 6 running backs to ever get a 99 overall grade from Next Gen Stats. Every other player has a top 5 finish at some point in their career so far, except Travis Etienne. And on top of that, like I said, he was on pace for a top 10 finish. They're going to get a massive QB upgrade, most likely Aaron Rodgers. I'm all in on Breece Hall. But let's move on to another potential workhorse running back, and that is Nick Chubb. So the next storyline that we're talking about is Kareem Hunt's probably gone. He's not going to be in town anymore. D'Ernest Johnson is now a free agent. He's probably not going to be in town anymore. So Josh, are you buying or selling Nick Chubb being used as a true workhorse this year without Kareem Hunt or D'Ernest Johnson on the Browns?
If that's the narrative that's going around, this feels like a classic sell. Nick Chubb is 28 years old, coming off the most carries of his career. And he still wasn't even a full workhorse last year. And I just don't think that Cleveland views him that way. And I don't think that they should. So I understand that Hunt is gone, but they're going to have Jerome Ford or someone else in that role. That is not just, we lost Kareem Hunt. I guess Nick Chubb's going to take all that work. It's generally just not smart to overload your 27-year-old running back to begin with. And what we've seen is that Nick Chubb is just incredibly efficient at 16 to 18 carries a game, with a tiny bit of passing work sprinkled in. Maybe this is the year that he gets a little bit more passing work, but in terms of going full on workhorse, no, I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think that that really needs to happen for him to once again put up similar fantasy points to what he's done pretty much throughout his entire career.
Well, I think I go both ways here. So for one, I think last year I was an ageist. The Fresh Fantasy Podcast listeners know that, whenever someone hit that 27-year-old, I automatically just hated them in fantasy. And maybe that narrative was not so correct in doing my reflection postseason. So I'm actually not going to fade Nick Chubb for being 28, but I am going to fade Nick Chubb as a true workhorse. Here's why. I think people are overlooking this a lot. So last year, people are obviously saying, okay, well, Alex, Kareem Hunt averaged 9.8 touches per game, and he's probably going to be gone. That's 10 touches a game open for Nick Chubb. And, Nick Chubb is going to see all this extra work because it's no D'Ernest Johnson or Nick Chubb. But here's the biggest thing. Nick Chubb last year in the NFL was 5th in touches per game. That is touches per game. It's not total touches because he played every game. That is on a per game basis. And he averaged 19.4. The leader in the NFL was Josh Jacobs, who averaged 23.9 touches. That is a 4-touch difference between Nick Chubb and the leader. I don't think that's that great of a difference, especially for a guy like Nick Chubb that historically averages less than 2 targets per game. So maybe that's a couple extra carries. So if you want to put that at maybe 4 extra carries, you're going to get an extra maybe 20 yards a game max from Nick Chubb. The point here is being that people think that Nick Chubb is going to get unlocked as this true workhorse and he's going to start seeing all of Kareem Hunt's touches. But in reality, there wasn't that big of a difference as you would think between Nick Chubb and the NFL leader in touches per game at that point. So Nick Chubb would have to be the leader to even get that extra 4 touches per game, but anything below that leader, it might be 1 extra touch per game or 2 extra touches per game. And ultimately that is just not going to get it done for me. Like you said, he's still a 28-year-old running back, and the highest finish of his career was the running back 6. Again, he's as safe as it comes, but ultimately I don't think that he has that top 3 ceiling that people are making it out to be potentially here without Kareem Hunt. But talking about that potential top running backs and the RB1 and older running backs, let's continue that discussion with Austin Eckler. So, Josh, Austin Eckler is going to be 28 years old this year. He just posted a fire pic of him on Twitter, looking jacked, saying he's ready for another running back one season. He is a friend to the fantasy community and someone that is one of the most beloved players in all of fantasy football land, as they should. I love Austin Eckler, but should we be fading Austin Eckler because he is 28 years old? Are you buying or selling Austin Eckler as a 28-year-old running back as the consensus running back one in fantasy football this year, or top two rather, with Christian McCaffrey?
So I'm not buying that he should just be this obvious consensus running back 1-2 type. And part of it's 28, but that's not all of it. I'm a little bit concerned about new offensive coordinator Kellen Moore, who's coming over from Dallas. I think we all know what happened in the Dallas backfield the past few years. Tony Pollard was always better, a lot better than Zeke. And what happened? They would still split work about down the middle. Pollard would end up scoring more fantasy points this past year because he's just too explosive, too good at football. I think that's probably what happens regardless of who is there in Los Angeles with Eckler. Eckler's going to be the guy getting a lot of those high value touches. He's such a good player himself, but we also can factor in the age. We say, all right, new offensive coordinator who's always like two running backs, even when he had a Tony Pollard type who's just a singular talent like an Eckler. The age, 28, that's not very good. And also, Austin Eckler is very vocal about how he doesn't want his workload to be as big. He had over 200 carries, over 100 receptions last year. That is over 300 touches for a 200-pound running back. That is probably too many. I think his touches come down significantly. I think Eckler wants them to come down significantly. Part of it was out of necessity. When your running back room is an injured Isaiah Spiller and Josh Kelly, and when your receiver room has injured Keenan Allen and injured Mike Williams, it makes sense that Eckler would be pressed into this super workhorse type role. I don't think he's going to have that this next year. I think he's going to be very good for fantasy once again, but I think there's going to be some natural touchdown regression at a certain point, just given his size and how he doesn't even monopolize goal line carries. And then on top of that, he wants fewer touches. He's 28, new offensive coordinator. There's just too many changing parts for me to see him as this locked in early to mid first round pick in fantasy football.
I'm not sure I agree. I'm actually going to be buying him as a consensus top two running back. And here's why. I think the offensive coordinator thing is a great point, and I'm curious to kind of dive more into that and do more research on, Kellen Moore. But, ultimately, like, he played, the Zeke and Tony Pollard backfield because, like, Zeke was really productive up until last year. I actually will push against the argument that Zeke was a completely fallen off, washed up version of himself. I think that, you can argue the fact that he played on the torn PCL the year before and that he wasn't efficient and Tony Pollard always should have gotten more touches. Well, I agree with that, but I think they split it pretty well. But ultimately with Austin Eckler, like, as much as he said that, let's decrease my workload, he was still averaging 20 touches a game last year. He's been saying for 2 years now, both seasons where he finished as a top three back, that, my workload needs to go down. He's been saying that for 2 years, but it really hasn't happened. I think the concern for me is the trade request. If he goes to a different team, how do they use him a little bit more? I'm a little bit less concerned about the offensive coordinator change, but I think that for me, it's more, okay, does he go to a different team? And if he does, I think that's where things change. But if the offensive backfield looks anywhere like it did this year, regardless of Kellen Moore or not, they're going to have no choice but to feed Austin Eckler. I hope they give him the contract that he deserves, because he tweeted out today that he's been underpaid. But ultimately, I think that he does get his money, and I think he does keep his touches, and I think that he is the safest running back in football. You saw 127 targets last year. As we all know, targets are worth about 3 times as much as a carry, and that alone is going to keep Austin Eckler in the top 5 conversation every single year as long as he stays healthy. But let's move on to wide receivers. Sticking with the old guys like Austin Eckler and Nick Chubb and these guys that are just ancient in NFL years, even though they are only 28 years old. But let's talk about Cooper Kupp, who is over the dreaded 3-0. He's over 30 years old now. Should Cooper Kupp still be ranked as a top 5 wide receiver, at 30 years old? The Matthew Stafford concern. Josh, are you buying or selling Cooper Kupp as a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football land this year?
I'm selling. Could I be buying later on in the offseason? Yes. I'll explain why I'm not sold. So I think there's the Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase tier of wide receiver. I don't think anyone can debate that. These are two guys that are under 25 years old on truly historic career paths. That should be your top two. I think if it's not your top two, the only other guy that I think you could reasonably make the case for would be Tyreek Hill because of the unique talent that he is. But I kind of view the next tier as Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, AJ Brown, and CeeDee Lamb. Elite receivers with quarterback continuity. Then we get to Cooper Kupp. I don't know what's happening with Stafford. If I was him, I'd retire. He's made a lot of money. He's had multiple back surgeries. He's even talked about how he might retire. The Rams are in tank mode. They got rid of Jalen Ramsey for very little in return. Cooper Kupp is going to be 30 years old, coming off of a major ankle injury. I think there's too many moving parts. It kind of feels like the Eckler one where I'm like, oh, like there's just a lot going on that's shifting around. And if we don't know who his quarterback is, if we don't know if the Rams are going to try and contend this year or not, if we don't know how his ankle is, we know that he's 30. There's just a lot going on there. And I think that there's other receivers with fewer question marks. If in a couple months it's clear he's back with Stafford and they have a respectable wide receiver room surrounding him to make sure that he's not just double or even triple covered at times, then yes, I think we can move him back to the top 5 spot. But I think for right now at this point in the offseason, no, I think it would be a little bit premature to just vault him in there.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also going to be selling Cooper Kupp as a top 5 wide receiver. I don't think it's going to change for me, even if their offensive realm looks a little bit more healthy, because Matthew Stafford, both in their Super Bowl year and last year, has dealt with some injuries as he's gotten older. He's talked about retiring. This team seems like it's clearly in pretty close to tank mode, but like right now, the top 8 wide receivers in consensus rankings are Jefferson and Chase, Kupp and Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, CeeDee Lamb, and AJ Brown. Like you said, I think the thing that you hit off perfectly was the question marks. If you look at either of those guys and you try to write a cons list for either one of those guys, the cons list is much longer for Cooper Kupp than probably any other wide receiver that is in the top 10 right now, both because of age, because of quarterback, because of what their team is looking like, what their wide receiver rooms are looking like, the safety of their offenses. Ultimately, Cooper Kupp has the longest, red flags list. Like, he's beautiful on the outside. He's done it for you. But ultimately, when you start to look a little bit deeper, there's just too many questions for things to work out. And I think people are looking a little bit too much at his past finishes and saying, well, if Cooper Kupp's in the field, he's a lock. And I agree. He probably is a lock. But I think there's just too many things that can go wrong for him to come out with just another automatic top 5 season. As much as I would love to see, Matthew Berry's little Cooper Kupp, little Coop Kupp to continue to be really great in fantasy football. But I want to change. We talked a lot about the veterans and the old guys, but let's talk about a few young guys. One of the young guys that I think is probably going to be one of the most debated wide receivers in all of fantasy football land this year is Christian Watson. Christian Watson did not have a great first half of the season. He looked like the best wide receiver that has ever existed, for parts of the second half of the season. Aaron Rodgers seems like he's on his way out. Jordan Love seems like he's on his way in. Christian Watson was also a rookie last year. So you can spin this narrative so many different ways to make it look like he's on pace for the greatest sophomore season of all time, or he's absolutely screwed now that Aaron Rodgers is gone from this team. So what are you doing, Josh? Are you buying or selling Christian Watson as a top 24 wide receiver in fantasy this coming year?
I am buying him as a top 24 wide receiver. He started from week 10 onward last year as a rookie, and from that point onward as a starter. 22% target share, 26.5% targets per route run or target rate, 2.78 yards per route run, the average depth of target of 16.5. And you might say, all right, Josh, thanks for those numbers. Put that in context. All right. That was the highest yards per route run in the NFL from week 10 onward. That's very efficient. He had the 12th highest target rate, which is per route. How often is he getting the ball? 12th highest. And here's why that is absolutely ludicrous. It's because he had the second highest average depth of target in the NFL during that span, behind only Justin Watson, who is, funny enough, also named Watson. But more interesting is that he is purely a situational deep threat. His target share during this span was 6%. That's right, Christian Watson, the only guy that had the number 2 ADOT, but the 22% target share, that is much higher than 6%. Jordan Love can be pretty terrible. And if he gets this type of role, it's pretty hard for him not to finish inside the top 24. I had him ranked pretty consistently as a top 12 fantasy wide receiver once he became a starter with Aaron Rodgers last year. So I'm very comfortable continuing to keep him inside my top 24, knowing that even though the quarterback situation, the overall offensive environment might not be great, this guy is going to get one of the most unique and highly fantasy relevant roles in football. It's kind of like Calvin Ridley from a few years ago when he had his huge breakout. When you get a high target share at a high downfield depth on the field, that is going to be fantasy gold, especially when you also run a 4-3 like Christian Watson.
Well, you also talk about like the great, Matt Harmon, in reception perception and how players do against what coverages. And historically, he's really preached that, the players that succeed against man coverage the most are the most likely to succeed this year. And I have not seen, Christian Watson's, success rate against each type of coverage. But one thing I could find was that on the 33rdteam.com/the-edge was one of the greatest fantasy tools to ever exist that charts what players do well against what coverages. Christian Watson last year as a rookie wide receiver had the highest fantasy points per snap in the NFL against man coverage. I don't know how well that is that him beating man coverage, but on a per snap basis, there was no one that scored more fantasy points than Christian Watson last year as a rookie. Is it going to be the same, without Aaron Rodgers? Probably not. But Christian Watson's also going to get better, in his second year. And you also throw in the fact that he is the second most athletic wide receiver, that has ever been graded. According to MathBomb, that charts the relative athletic score of every wide receiver, the only wide receiver over the last 36 years with a higher athletic score than Christian Watson was Calvin Johnson. That's it. End of list. Christian Watson is number 2 over 35 years. He has the athleticism. He has the target share. He has the fantasy points per snap versus man coverage. All signs point to him having a really good season. And ultimately, if he fails, he doesn't. We talk about on this podcast a lot about chasing upside and always change the highest possible range of outcomes. And ultimately, where he's going in drafts right now, around the late 20s, early 30s for wide receivers, there aren't many players that have more upside than Christian Watson does going into next season. I really like him. But let's talk about some players that are even farther, down the list. And this one is the only question I think that we have that is not about one player specifically, but rather a group. And those are the rookies. Every year, rookies get drafted to their teams at the wide receiver position. And every year we say, okay, they're going to be a rookie. They're going to struggle out of the gates, whether it's because if it's a COVID year or, the chemistry with a new quarterback, or they're learning a new scheme every year. But every year, rookie receivers seem to outdo that. We've had 7 straight years where a rookie wide receiver finished inside the top 24. But Josh, this year, do you think a rookie wide receiver is going to finish top 15 in fantasy football? I know you've done a little bit of research about some rookie wide receivers. What do you think is going to happen with these rookies this year? Are you buying or selling someone finishing inside the top 15?
I'll sell that. This receiver class, it's not as good as the last few years. Jackson Smith and Jigba, I think he has the best shot, but I just don't think it happens. The class overall is not as good on paper. Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave were both around wide receiver 20, if not just outside wide receiver 20 per game last year, depending on what scoring system you use. And they were, quite frankly, they projected to be better fantasy assets, honestly, than someone like JSN for year one. I understand that Smith and Jigba had that ridiculous sophomore season, but at the same time, we have to remember this is a guy that has only played one season of college football. There's a little bit of risk. There's some injury concerns. There's just some concerns in general if he can play outside. I don't really think that matters too much for fantasy points. More fantasy points nowadays are given to slot receivers than outside receivers, but still lacking that versatility. It's not necessarily a quote-unquote good thing for fantasy. And I think he has the best shot. He's the most pro-ready out of this group. But if I'm just kind of tying my horse to that carriage, no, and I don't think he's quite as good of a prospect as a few of the guys last year, then I'll say no, that it won't happen this year.
I'm gonna buy that it will happen. And I think that like JSN for me is definitely the guy that's most likely going to do it. But to touch on your Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson point, I think both of those guys for me are top 10 dynasty wide receivers. I think they're both going to be 2 of the better wide receivers in the entire NFL within the next couple of years. But they also had 2 of the most awful quarterback situations in the entire league. Yes, I know that both of them got productive quarterback play from different quarterbacks for parts of the season. Like I know Andy Dalton had some awesome PFF grades and was phenomenal, for a few games, but he wasn't starting, the whole season for them. The same thing with Garrett Wilson, where his splits with and without Zach Wilson were absolutely ridiculous last year. And then that's the only reason that those guys finished, where they did, where I think they both would have been top 15 had they had a more productive quarterback. So obviously landing spot is going to matter relative to this question, but we've seen 7 straight wide receivers finish inside the top 24, regardless of class, regardless of landing spots or quarterbacks or the adjustment, or whether they played one season in college or they played 4 or 5, even for some players. But ultimately, someone finds a way. Does that mean that I'm automatically going to draft every rookie wide receiver because one of them is going to finish in the top 15? No, it doesn't. But I think the point of this discussion was to say, okay, rookie wide receivers in general are undervalued every single year because people just don't want to be patient with them and they let them go. But ultimately, they seem to outproduce their ADP every year. Maybe they're not going to finish top 15, but a lot of them, especially the ones that get drafted inside the top 10, tend to outproduce their value. But let's move on from wide receivers to the final position of the day. Oh, sorry, we have one more wide receiver discussion to talk about. And this is probably the one I was the most excited about because this is one that has a lot of fantasy football implication, and that's the teammate wide receivers. What I mean by teammate wide receivers, everyone has teammates, but how many teammates both finish as top 12 wide receivers? It seems like every year there's at least one pair of wide receivers that finish in the top 10, but what about 2? Last year we had 2 pairs. Both T. Higgins, Devontae Smith, Jamar Chase, and A.J. Brown all finished around the top 12 wide receivers in points per game. This year, both T. Higgins and Devontae Smith are both going as top 13 wide receivers, and Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill are also going as top 13. So we have 6 players inside the top 13 that are on a total of 3 teams. Josh, do you think that we're overvaluing some of these teammates, or do you think the stackability of them, at least in redraft league, is going to help carry their fantasy value?
So before I get to that, a quick note on the rookie receivers. I actually wrote a free article that I released yesterday on the 33rdteam.com looking at how rookie wide receivers score and why they are a fantasy cheat code in terms of how they score their fantasy points. So would recommend people check that out, and that is a totally free article. Moving on to multiple sets of teammates. I think I had a pretty controversial tweet last week. I didn't realize it'd be so controversial. I listed my top 5 favorite wide receiver duos in the NFL, and people hated it. And I'll say who those duos are because I think we're going to get multiple sets of teammates finishing in the top 12, and I'll give 5 candidates for which teammates can do it. I think Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, 2 guys that are going to get around 22 to 27% target shares in what should be a good offense. They were on pace to do it before Tua got injured. The team signed Mike White, so they now have a very competent backup quarterback should Tua get injured again. Chase Higgins, I think that's obvious. They pretty much did it last year. A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, they pretty much did it last year. If not, I think they actually did do it last year. So right there, those are 3 candidates. And then I've got 2 more for you. One of them is Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams.
Ooh.
2 really young players. I'll actually touch on one of them more in depth shortly. And then Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk was nearly a top 12 wide receiver last season in his first year playing with Trevor Lawrence, when Trevor Lawrence was in his first year playing under Doug Peterson. Now we get Calvin Ridley injected into this offense, who was a top 12 wide receiver the last time we saw him on a broken foot. Right there, that's 5 duos. I think we've got a decent chance to have 2 of those 5 having both those guys as top 12 wide receivers.
Wow. But that's the part I struggle with though, is do you think that overall as a whole, it's a great strategy? Because I think that it ultimately is, because I think that there's the safety involved, because I think there's a place to win and lose your fantasy leagues. And I think that the part I struggle with the most and kind of go back and forth on all the time is if I draft T. Higgins or Devontae Smith, can I win my league with them? But I mean, when you're drafting them that early, and I think the answer is yes, but it's still a hesitant yes, because they're never going to finish top 5 unless the other guy gets hurt. But the biggest thing I want to touch on from your point was Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk. Those are the guys that I'm going to be talking about. And the point of this whole discussion is yes, you can draft your T. Higgins and your Devontae Smith that are already going around the top 12. But for me, I'm buying the discount teammates all day. I'm investing, in this year's potential breakouts with Trevor Lawrence is someone I'm going to be investing a lot in. He showed a lot of signs down the stretch. He's going to be big. They add in someone like Calvin Ridley, who wrote a beautiful Players Tribune article about the things that he thinks he can do this year. You add in the dynamic of Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram, and I think this is going to be a super slept on offense. And those are the teammates that I'm going to be investing in. Ultimately, am I going to be paying the price for Devontae Smith and T. Higgins very often? Probably not, because I think the ceiling is capped, but I will be investing in the teammates that are being drafted a little bit later, like your Christian Kirks and Calvin Ridleys. And ultimately, those are going to be the guys that I'm going after, and I love them so much. Do you have anything else to add on the wide receiver teammate discussion, or do you want to move on to tight ends?
What I like about someone like Devonta Smith or T. Higgins, because I understand people will be like, all right, well, the upside's capped outside of injury. And I'm like, well, isn't that kind of most of these players? Like Devontae Adams. You want to know when Devontae Adams went nuclear last year? When Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller got injured. You want to know when a lot of these running backs go absolutely nuclear? It's when the backup gets injured and suddenly it's him versus a third stringer and they go, you know what? Let's just start giving this guy more work. So I don't really care too much that Devonta Smith might, quote unquote, need the AJ Brown injury to finish as a top 4 wide receiver, when he can probably still finish as a top 12 wide receiver like last year with AJ Brown still there. And if something happens to AJ Brown, then Devonta Smith gets catapulted. So I really wouldn't worry about that part too much, just because pretty much everyone outside of like a Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Christian McCaffrey, Travis Kelce, there's like a couple elite guys, and then pretty much everyone else, you're kind of hoping for some type of injury to happen to a teammate of theirs for them to really catapult themselves into league winner status.
Yeah, I love that. And that's a really great point, and I'm completely on board. And there's a good discussion on them. But let's move on to the tight end position. Couple guys I want to touch on, and the first one is Kyle Pitts. So Kyle Pitts is currently ranked as a top 5 tight end, but I think you can go both ways. And I wanted to kind of open up the floor on this one to you, because I think that you always have really good points on a discussion like this. And for one, the Falcons last year averaged 24 pass attempts per game, one of the worst rates, over the last 20 years. And now at QB, they're rocking with Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke. They could still sign a Lamar Jackson or another free agent, but ultimately it seems like they're going to be going with Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke, embracing the tank. Kyle Pitts had the greatest rookie tight end season of all time. He's still the highest drafted tight end of all time. But last year they ran the ball as much as almost any team in the NFL with no really great running backs. And it seemed like it was the whole Arthur Smith conundrum, that Arthur Smith does not want to throw the ball, and whether they're winning games running the ball or they're embracing the tank, whatever it is, the pass volume just never seemed to came. And it ultimately does not seem like it's going to come this year with the quarterbacks they currently have. I get it could be better with Desmond Ridder, but I still don't think it's ultimately going to be very great. So ultimately, where are you at with Kyle Pitts? Do you think that he should still be ranked as a top 5 tight end because, he has as much upside as probably any tight end in the entire NFL, not named Travis Kelce? Or do you think we should be a little bit more worried about him because of the coaching staff and the quarterbacks at play? Where are you standing right now at this point in the offseason on Kyle Pitts?
So I'll start with this. I think there's only 2 tight ends that are just so clearly that much better in fantasy projections than Pitts at this stage. Travis Kelce and TJ Hawkinson. TJ Hawkinson had more targets per game as a Viking last year than Kelce did as a Chief last year. Unbelievable. The role for Hawkinson was so ridiculous. And then after that, I'm just not as excited about Mark Andrews. Kittle, he's buried. We don't know who the quarterback is. He's the best tight end ever, probably, from a well-rounded aspect in terms of blocking, after the catch, route running, receiving, but he struggles to stay healthy. He's kind of buried in a very good receiving room with no quarterback. Dallas Goedert, he's behind AJ Brown and Devonta Smith, and Jalen Hurts likes to vulture touchdowns at the goal line. So then you go, okay, well, Kyle Pitts. I think Kyle Pitts should be ranked as a top 5 tight end. I'm just not super confident in him actually finishing there. And I'll lay out the conundrum with him. Like you said, the Arthur Smith conundrum. Here's the Kyle Pitts conundrum. So Arthur Smith, as we know, has the history of slow-paced, run-heavy offenses. That's not good. But Kyle Pitts did have the highest target rate among all tight ends last year, which means per route, he was getting targeted more often than any other player at the position. And only 5 tight ends. Chigoziem Okonkwo, gotta love that guy. Travis Kelce, Dallas Goedert, Mark Andrews, George Kittle had more yards per route run. So even with awful quarterback play, Kyle Pitts was getting fed the ball more often per route than any other tight end. And even with that awful quarterback play, was still 6th in yards per route run. And only Mark Andrews actually had a higher target share in his offense. Kyle Pitts is a unicorn. And I think the reason we should still rank him as a top 5 tight end, even though I think there's a good chance he won't finish there, is because what do we need from Kyle Pitts? Nothing. He is already showing that he is probably the best tight end in fantasy football from a peripherals perspective. What we need from the Falcons is something competent at quarterback and or a little more pass volume. And I just don't think we can fully fade him when we're not actually sure what the Falcons game plan will be. I think it's concerning. I don't like that they brought in Jonnu Smith, who the last time he played under Arthur Smith in Tennessee had 8 touchdowns on only 41 receptions. He could be someone that is vulturing some of those touchdowns at the goal line. That concerns me. It also concerns me that they might be in the mix for an early draft capital running back. But at the same time, we do see teams have weird stretches. We saw last year to start the season, Justin Fields and the Bears literally just didn't pass. And every now and then we see the opposite, where a team has a really high pass rate for a few straight weeks. Could that be in the fantasy playoffs next year for Kyle Pitts? Definitely could. So because of all those factors that I mentioned, it's murky, but I will still want to rank him as a top 5 tight end, knowing that he probably can't finish too much lower than that this year, since we had basically historically low pass volume last year. I don't think that continues, but the bad quarterback play is still a concern. And because of that, I think he's a very risky top 5 tight end, but we should be ranking him there because if a couple things fall into place in that Falcons offense, he can easily be the tight end 1 in fantasy, given all of his peripherals.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly where I'm at. Just I think I'm at the tight end 5 right now in my early rankings, because it's ultimately just like all the peripherals are correct. It's just like whether or not they're going to give him, what they deserve, and the volume side of things. I think the volume side is the only thing holding him back. The other side that I want to talk about is George Kittle. Simply put, George Kittle or Kyle Pitts, who are you drafting this year if you had to take one in a redraft league?
I would take Kyle Pitts.
Okay.
I think he's going to be a little bit more consistent. I just cannot see how they're going to throw the ball 23, 24 times a game once again.
Yeah.
And with George Kittle, we still don't even know who the quarterback is. I was talking to a friend the other day. If the Carolina Panthers were trotting out a quarterback room of Sam Darnold, Trey Lance, and an injured Brock Purdy, we would be roasting them.
Yep.
The San Francisco 49ers quarterback situation has been deteriorating the last few years. And I think at this point, it's hit kind of a record low. I'm not saying they can't get good quarterback play out of them. We know what Kyle Shanahan has done, but I think he's threading the needle more and more as the quarterback room just gets worse and worse. So I think there's actually concerns for Kittle with the quarterback situation as well. And Pitts at this point is only dealing with Drake London, whereas Pitts has Ayuk, Debo, and Christian McCaffrey, who we should essentially count as a wide receiver given his pass game role.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have Kittle one spot higher than Kyle Pitts. I'm completely, but sorry, I don't agree with you. I don't know what I was saying. Sorry, I like Kittle more. I think Kittle ultimately he's productive every year. Yes, he is over 30 years old, but the quarterback situation has not exactly been deteriorating. So I don't think it's ever really been that great. Like if Jimmy Garoppolo being the great part of their QB situation, then I'm sorry, then Jimmy Garoppolo is phenomenal. But whether it's been, CJ Beathard or Nick Mullins or Jimmy Garoppolo or Trey Lance for a couple of games or Brock Purdy, it does not matter who, or Josh. It does not matter who the quarterback has been for this team. George Kittle has been productive year in and year out when he's been healthy. Over the last 5 years of his career, he's finished as the tight end 2, 3, 4, 3, and tight end 20 in a year that he broke his foot and only played 8 games. Ultimately, it might not be pretty, but regardless of the weapons around him, George Kittle has been productive year in and year out, and I trust their team to find a way to get George Kittle the ball. Their offense is going to be higher powered and probably having more total plays per game than any Atlanta Falcons offense will. And for that reason, I'm going to keep Kyle Pitts just behind George Kittle for now. And that is ultimately where I stand. But Josh, before we get out of here, we have one final question for you. Bringing it back, what is your flag plant for the 2023 season? The one player or take that you believe in more than anything else? The floor is all yours.
Apparently, this is a hot take. I've been workshopping this on social media in some articles, and I've gotten a lot of feedback that I am too high on Jameson Williams. He is my 2023 flag plant. I think Jameson Williams is really, really good at football. That should not be a hot take. He would be the wide receiver 1 in this class if he came out in 2023. We gushed about Christian Watson's role. That is what I expect from Jameson Williams. 20% or higher target share at a really high average depth of target with elite speed. I understand it's Jared Goff, but Jared Goff supported receivers like Brandon Cooks quite handily when he had a good offensive line. And what do you know? The Lions might have the best offensive line in football this year, giving him time to let the play develop and hit Jameson Williams. I would even say that Jameson Williams moves better than Christian Watson overall. They're similar speed, but I think JMO is just better lateral quickness, a more dynamic athlete overall. And we have to remember that Detroit traded up in the first round to get Jameson Williams when they knew he wouldn't be a factor as a rookie. So people out there saying, oh yeah, he's just going to be really, really good for real football, but not fantasy football. You don't understand. It's like Henry Ruggs. He's going to be a deep threat. Really? You trade up in the first round and give up a future first round pick for that player? I don't believe so. And I don't believe his college profile suggests that's what he's going to be either. He had nearly 1,600 receiving yards as a junior. That is not, oh yeah, he's just a situational deep threat type guy. He has an expansive route tree. He had a full year to rest, relax, rehab, and learn this offense. And at the end of the day, he only had 2 touches as a rookie. A 41-yard touchdown reception and a 40-yard jet sweep. This guy is so ridiculously explosive. He's going to be in a high-volume role this year. And I don't see how JMO finishes outside the top 24 wide receivers. I think he's probably going to finish around wide receiver 15. And if you look on Underdog Fantasy, which is the platform with the most reps of drafts behind their ADP, he is the wide receiver 31 on that platform. That is just ridiculous for someone that I think is, I don't see how he finishes outside the top 24. I think he finishes probably closer to top 15. And like Christian Watson last year, where we saw him basically be a top 5 wide receiver when he started, that is in the cards for Jameson Williams. And you just cannot find receivers going that late in fantasy drafts with his type of profile. And it's this ridiculous injury discount. And because the Lions slow played him as a rookie, it has people spooked. You just need to go back and look at the profile overall. This is the nuts. This is what we want in fantasy football. High depth of target, can run every route, going to have a high target share, and cannot be taken down after the catch. You need to be drafting Jameson Williams in fantasy football.
I like that. That's why we call it the flag plant every year, the boldest prediction that you believe in. I clearly need to be a little bit higher on Jameson Williams. Josh, you convinced me as well as you probably possibly could, and I hope the listeners were convinced as well. Before we get out of here, where can the people find you, your links, anywhere else that you'll be posting fantasy football content for the people that enjoyed today? Josh, you've been an amazing guest, but where can they find you across all your platforms?
You can find me on Twitter at JLurkyTweets. And more importantly, go to the33rdteam.com. You can find my and my team's content. Alex will have some content on the33rdteam.com as well. We have a great roster of full-timers, part-timers, contributors, researchers. We've got some great video editors on staff, graphics people. It's truly just an A team. I'm really lucky to be a part of it. And all of our content right now for the next few months is free, so make sure to check that out. We will have a rookie guide coming out in a few weeks with a soon-to-be-announced lead dynasty analyst.
Wow.
That I've had my eye on for multiple years, wanted to hire this guy. So we're going to have some really good stuff coming out very soon. And just once again, that rookie wide receiver article is free and on the33rdteam.com to learn why rookie wide receivers are a fantasy cheat code. Alex Caruso, thank you for having me on as your first guest. I'm honored. And I'm excited that we get to both be friends and get to work together at times. So this was a great way to start my Tuesday.
I love that. I appreciate it. No, it's been a blast, to have you on the show, and it's been a blast with you listeners. At the beginning of season 4, each episode is only going to get bigger and better. Today we're knocking the rust off a little bit. I think that we have some great things in store. Just wait and see. I think this is going to be the biggest and best season yet of the Fresh Fantasy Podcast. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to keep chasing that upside. Until next time, everybody.